This happened when I was a kid, so some of the details are a little fuzzy. But I still remember the important parts. I grew up in Nebraska, and I used to ride my bike to school every day because my parents worked all the time. It was easier that way. We lived in a rural area surrounded by farmland, and the route to school, I would pass by a huge cornfield. Looking back, it probably wasn't that big, but it seemed to go on forever. Especially when I was a kid, our house was on the other side of the field, but my parents were always clear about one thing: don't cross the cornfield. They were worried that I would get lost without a cell phone, and I didn't really question it. I had seen how easy it was to lose a sense of direction there, so every day I would stay on the main road and cycle around it. I didn't have many friends living near my house, so I would always cycle alone. Don't mind the long rides. I actually started to like cycling because I did it so often. On the weekends, I would go cycling even if I didn't have to. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but it was definitely a weekday because I was cycling home from school. The chain on my bike came loose. I don't remember how, but it came off completely, and I couldn't figure out how to put it back on, no matter how hard I tried. My dad taught me how to fix my bike, but nothing I tried worked. Like I said, I didn't have a phone at the time, so I couldn't call my parents and ask for help. I wasn't going to ask some random stranger passing by to give me a ride either. I knew better. I was on my own, so that's when I looked at the cornfield and walked home the normal way. It was going to take forever, but going through the cornfield would save me a ton of time. I knew my parents had warned me about going in there, but I figured it couldn't be that hard to find my way. After all, I only had to walk to the right. So I made up my mind and pushed my bike through the cornfield. I told myself it would be a quick shortcut. It was fine at first. The path I found between the rows of corn was narrow, but clear enough to walk on. The stalks towered over me, and I remember there was a slight breeze that day. Imagine walking through a cornfield when you were a kid. The stalks feel 10 times higher, and everything started to feel 10 times bigger. It started to make me feel a little uneasy. The corn also blocked out most of the light, and it was strangely quiet there. I can't remember why, but I often looked behind me. Not sure what scared me, but I remember just wanting to get out of there. After a few minutes, I started to hear a slight rustling sound coming from the corn a little off the path. I stopped and listened, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind. This time, it was a little louder and a little closer, and I started to think that it might be an animal following me, but I didn't know what kind of animal would make that much noise. I remember having a hard time breathing. I wish I had never entered that cornfield. I started walking faster, but I didn't want to leave my bike behind. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but every few minutes the rustling would come back. Like whatever it was keeping up with me. Eventually the rustling stopped, and I felt a wave of relief. Maybe 10 minutes went by without any strange noises. I decided to change the roads to be safe, so I turned a corner, and right there, in the middle of the road, there was a man standing with his arms outstretched looking at me. He didn't look like a farmer or someone who belonged there. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had long scratches on both arms. I don't know how else to describe it. They were long marks that seemed to be engraved on his arm. I froze, not knowing what to do, but then he spoke. He asked me in a low, hoarse voice. If I was lost, I didn't answer. I was glued to the ground. Then he took a step towards me and said he would help me find my way home. I felt like I was in sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. Every instinct in me was screaming to run away, but I couldn't. He started walking faster. He reached out his hands towards me. That's when my legs took over. I let go of my bike and started running as fast as I could. He was chasing me and screaming that he only wanted to help me. I didn't stop running. As I passed through the corn behind me, I could often hear him yelling for me to stop. I dived into one of the corn stalks and squatted down in a ball with my eyes closed. I tried to make myself look as small as possible. Honestly, thought I was going to die. He was holding what looked like a rope in his hand as he passed by. He muttered to himself, "I will find her. I will never forget these words as long as I live." I hid for hours. My legs were cramping and my whole body, my inner body was shaking us, but I didn't dare move until I came to my senses. When I finally crawled out of Egypt and made my way home, he was gone. I was sure. I was shaking so badly I could barely walk. By then, it was dark. I finally found my way home. I ran to my parents, who were wondering where I was. I told them everything. My mother was in tears, and my father looked like he was ready. By then, there was not much they could do to kill someone, but he was long gone. My dad went looking for my bike, but he couldn't find it anywhere. A few days later, they bought me a new one, and life went on. A few weeks later, something else happened that eventually caused us to move. One day, I came home from school, and there on the porch was my old bike that I had left in the cornfield. I don't remember who was more scared, me or my parents. My parents didn't feel safe with me in that house anymore, so we moved out right away. My parents don't talk about it much, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. I found a dead-end job in Iowa that pays a good buck to get away from things. It's not that bad. I certainly won't stay here forever, but the peace and quiet is good for me. There is a lot of farmland around here. I'm sure it doesn't surprise any of you. The rural setting is definitely not something I'm used to coming from the city, but I'm slowly getting used to it. About 6 months ago, I found a modest house with very cheap rent and lived in it for a few months. The house itself was small. The land was actually quite large. I had a lot more land in the backyard than I knew what to do with. I'm not sure if it was farmed or abandoned, but right next to my house was a large cornfield. The field ended in a small wooden fence that stood a few meters away from the physical structure. You could almost touch the outside of the house and the fence at the same time. As you can imagine, they were that close. I didn't have any cornfields, neighbors. Contrary to what you might think, I found the isolation really peaceful. Sometimes in the evenings I found myself looking out the window at the field, the stalks swaying gently in the wind as I thought about my life. If it weren't for what I'm about to tell you, I probably would have stayed home for a longer period of time. It was a windy October night, one of those cold nights when you just want to sit in the comfort of a warm bedroom and look out the window at the wind blowing. In fact, when the weather is like this, I like being outside. I know I'm a bit weird about it. There's something about putting my hands in my jacket pockets when it's cold that makes me feel good. I was smoking on the back deck of the house. I was surveying the garden once more before I went inside. I was almost finished when I heard a scream. It wasn't like the distant animal cries you sometimes hear in the countryside. No, this was different. It was sharp. The sound could have belonged to a child, maybe a little boy. The sound was echoing from the cornfield just beyond the house. Without thinking, I ran inside, grabbed my shotgun, and went outside. I don't know what happened to me, but I couldn't ignore a child, potentially in danger. As I ran towards the cornfield, the scream came again louder. This time I stopped in my tracks. I scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. I called out to the child. I asked him to scream again so I could find him. At that moment, the adrenaline started to surge in me. I jumped over the fence, picked a random row of corn, and ran to him, using the shitty flashlight on my phone. I kept screaming, but the kid never screamed. I finally realized I was in over my head. I called the police and told them what I had heard before I went home. When the officers arrived, I insisted on helping them search the field. They let me help. The whole time, he never shouted, but there was nothing out there. No footprints, no sign of movement, not a single sign that anyone was in that field. We finally gave up. The officers told me to call back if I heard anything, and they left. I was disappointed, but what could I do? Part of me wondered if it was all a prank, which made sense. I'm sure the kids there were struggling to keep busy for hours. It just made me sick to my stomach. As much as I tried to convince myself it was a joke, I couldn't relax after that. Little did I know that the situation was about to go from 1 to 10. As I was upstairs getting ready for bed, something caught my eye outside the window. It was the last thing anyone would want to see. Outside a bedroom window, a pale orange glow. I ran to the window, and the small flames rising from the cornfield were flickering wildly in the darkness. I remember yelling holy over and over. I knew I had to do something. The fire wasn't very big, but I knew it would spread quickly. With the wind outside, I ran down the stairs while calling 911. I almost screamed into the phone. I grabbed the hose from the side of my house. I turned it on. I jumped over the fence and ran inside. I prayed it would be long enough to reach the fire. By the time I reached the fire, I was soaking wet, but I didn't care. I knew it would take forever for the fire brigade to get there. I was my only hope. I sprayed the flames as best I could. I did my best to contain it. I was incredibly lucky it didn't spread faster. I was able to extinguish it completely in just a few minutes. I bent down to catch my breath. I wondered why I was standing there, drenched in sweat and water. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned around, and I almost died on the spot. There was someone at the upstairs window of my house. They had gone into my bedroom without thinking. I left the hose that was still spraying water, and I ran into the house. I opened the door, and I burst into the kitchen, but I froze where I was. The whole room, my fridge was a mess, and the cabinets were all open, and a lot of my dishes were smashed on the floor. It was crazy, and I didn't know what to think. I barely had time to take in the chaos when I heard the front door slam. I turned and ran to the front door, but by the time I got there, whoever was inside was gone. I ran back outside, but they were nowhere in sight. I didn't have the energy to chase them. In fact, I thought I was gone. A few minutes later, the police and firemen finally arrived. I told them what happened, and this time they took things much more seriously. Attempted arson is a serious offense, and they treated it as such. A group of police officers and even some police dogs were brought in to do a more thorough search, but once again, they clearly found nothing. I had enough time to escape on foot for a couple of weeks. I couldn't sleep. Every sound of the creek, Every rustle of the night made me nervous. I slept on the floor, with my shotgun next to me every night until I got out. I kept thinking about what was happening. It didn't make any sense. But what hit me the most was that first scream. It made me sick to think that even 100 meters away from the mammoth, there could be a child in danger.